Most people assume Cuba's high European ancestry reflects the intensity of Spanish colonialism. It reflects the 19th century. Most people assume the Dominican Republic's African ancestry is roughly comparable to Puerto Rico's. It is nearly double. Most people assume all three islands experienced the same colonial demographic process under the same Spanish flag. They experienced three different ones, in three different centuries, shaped by three different economic systems, one of which was triggered by a revolution in a French colony that most Caribbean history courses cover for 4 sentences. The 3 DNA profiles are the forensic record of those three different systems. The misunderstanding is in assuming the same empire produced the same outcome. Before any of the three numbers can diverge, they share a starting point. This channel documented in the Taino video. And getting that baseline right changes how all three explanations land. The 2020 Nature study led by David Reich's laboratory confirmed that all three islands share the same pre-contact Taino maternal haplogroup foundation, A2 and C1, simultaneously. The divergence does not begin in the pre-contact period. It begins in what the colonial economy specifically required from each island when they required it, and what geographic and historical conditions either enabled or blocked. Colonial systems are not uniform demographic processes. They are economic systems that respond to crops, terrain, labor supply, and accidents of timing. The 3 Caribbean profiles are the genomic record of 3 different economic responses to the same conquest. Puerto Rico's 14% sits furthest from what a flat reading of colonial history would predict, and the reason is written into the island's own terrain before it appears in any genomic study. Puerto Rico shows the highest indigenous ancestry of the 3 islands, approximately 14% in modern autosomal studies. And the explanation is the same geographic mechanism the Taino video documented for the maternal haplogroup finding. The Puerto Rican mountain interior created terrain too inaccessible for the encomienda system to reach at the intensity it operated elsewhere. The Jíbaro communities in the interior preserved Taino maternal haplogroups at concentrations above the island average because the plantation economy that required intensive labor had limited footing in the mountains. The coastal communities experienced colonial demographic mixing at higher intensity. The interior communities experienced it at reduced intensity. What this looks like in modern genomic data is a measurable gradient. Mountain communities showing indigenous ancestry percentages significantly above the island average. Coastal communities showing levels closer to Cuban averages. Puerto Rico did not preserve more indigenous ancestry because its colonial system was less violent. It preserved more because its mountain terrain limited where the most demographic intensive version of that system could operate. The Dominican Republic's 39% is the number that took me longest to locate correctly, because the mechanism responsible for most of it sits on the other side of the island's interior border. Hispaniola was divided between 2 colonial powers whose economic systems operated at completely different scales. The Spanish Dominican side used the island for ranching, mining, and agriculture at intensities that, while significant, were dwarfed by what happened on the French side. The French colony of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, was at its late 18th century peak the most profitable plantation colony in the history of the Atlantic world. Approximately 40% of Europe's sugar and 50% of its coffee came from an island smaller than Portugal. That level of production required the most intensive African labor importation operation the Caribbean had ever seen. The demographic reality of Saint-Domingue was not contained to the Haitian side of the island. Population movements, trade networks, and the aftermath of the 1789 uprising and the 1804 Haitian Revolution created demographic flows across the island's interior that the Dominican national narrative has historically minimized. The Dominican Republic's higher African ancestry reflects both its own plantation economy and its geographic proximity to the most intensive African labor system the Caribbean produced. The island's shared land border made demographic containment between the two systems impossible. Cuba's number required me to go to a completely different century than I expected. And most people who look at it reach for the wrong one automatically. Cuba's 72% European ancestry is the highest of the 3 islands. The assumption most people bring to that number is that it reflects the intensity of the Spanish colonial period in the 16th and 17th centuries. The assumption is incorrect. The Haitian Revolution of 1804 destroyed the Saint-Domingue plantation system almost overnight, eliminating the Caribbean's largest sugar producer. Cuba moved to fill the vacuum. The Cuban sugar economy expanded dramatically through the first half of the 19th century, becoming the world's single largest sugar producer by the 1830s. That expansion required labor and capital, and it attracted Spanish immigration at a scale no previous period in Cuban history had produced. Between approximately 1820 and 1880, Cuba received more Spanish settlers, merchants, administrators, and planters than it had received in the preceding 3 centuries combined. The single most counterintuitive fact in Caribbean genomics is this: the demographic event most responsible for Cuba's elevated European ancestry was triggered by a revolution in a French colony. The Haitian Revolution destroyed one plantation system, and Cuba built a larger one in its place. The immigration wave that followed wrote itself into the Cuban genome at a scale that Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, which did not experience the same 19th century economic expansion, did not match. Cuba's 72% is not a colonial period outcome. It is a 19th century outcome whose trigger was located on a neighboring island. Before the test errors can be understood correctly, there is one additional layer running beneath all 3 European percentages that arrives from a direction most people don't associate with Caribbean ancestry. A significant proportion of Spanish colonists to all 3 islands came specifically from the Canary Islands rather than from mainland Spain. The Canary Islands carry their own distinct genetic profile, including ancestry from the Guanche people, the pre-Spanish indigenous population of the Canaries, who carried specific North African Berber genetic signatures. This Canarian signal appears in Caribbean populations at concentrations that differ by island, reflecting different patterns of Canarian emigration at different colonial periods. The consequence, part of what commercial DNA tests classify as European ancestry in Puerto Rican, Dominican, and Cuban profiles, is carrying a North African Berber signal through the Guanche ancestry of Canarian settlers. A Caribbean person with European ancestry on their results may be carrying indigenous, North African ancestry labeled as Iberian, without either category being identified correctly. 3 different colonial histories producing 3 different genomes also means 3 different categories of test error. Something I found clarifies the broader problem more precisely than the ancestry percentages alone. Puerto Rican results routinely underestimate indigenous ancestry. The reference panels commercial tests use cannot distinguish Caribbean Taino haplogroups from generic Native American ancestry. The Taino specific signal is absorbed into a broader category that produces a lower percentage than the actual proportion. Dominican results frequently misattribute sub-Saharan African regional ancestry, reflecting the specific West African ethnic composition of the Saint-Domingue slave trade routes. Fon, Yu, and Yoruba ancestry that dominates the Dominican African signal is sometimes misclassified because reference panels calibrate primarily against Atlantic slave trade populations without sufficient precision for the French colonial sourcing. Cuban results systematically obscure the East Asian signal from Chinese Cuban ancestry and conflate the Canarian European signal with general Iberian ancestry. 3 islands, 3 different categories of test error, all produced by the same underlying reality. The Caribbean's colonial demographic complexity exceeds what the reference panels were designed to resolve. The ancestry test errors are not where the consequences of 3 divergent colonial histories stop. They extend into medicine in ways that are measurable and underreported. Puerto Ricans show specific cardiovascular and metabolic variant frequencies linked to their higher indigenous ancestry component, frequencies that differ measurably from the profiles of Dominican Americans and Cuban Americans, despite all 3 being classified as Hispanic Caribbean in most clinical research. Dominican Americans show different cholesterol metabolism variant distributions than the other 2 populations, reflecting the specific West African ethnic composition of the Saint-Domingue slave trade, rather than the Spanish colonial trade routes that sourced the Cuban and Puerto Rican African ancestry. Cuban Americans' higher European ancestry proportion, and the specific Canarian, Iberian, and Sephardic Jewish components within that European percentage produces different hereditary cancer risk profiles, including BRCA variant distributions, than either of the other 2 populations. These are not subtle distinctions, they are measurable genomic differences with pharmacogenomic implications. The clinical consequence is one that the 3 different ancestries share, despite pointing in different directions. Caribbean Hispanic patients are routinely grouped as a single population in clinical studies, pharmaceutical trials, and treatment protocol development. Their genomic profiles are sufficiently different that treatment protocols calibrated to a combined Caribbean Hispanic average may be inaccurate for all three populations simultaneously, not because the research was careless, but because the input data treated as a single population what is actually three demographically distinct communities whose divergence was written by the same colonial systems that wrote the DNA differences. The same colonial history that explains why Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic have completely different DNA also explains why Caribbean patients receive less precise clinical guidance than populations whose internal diversity has been studied at the resolution it actually requires. 3 islands. 3 different colonial economic decisions. 3 genomic profiles that have been accumulating divergence since the same Taino maternal haplogroups were in all 3 simultaneously. The Jíbaro Mountains are in the Puerto Rican 14%, terrain that limited what the plantation system could reach. The Saint-Domingue system is in the Dominican 39%, a French plantation colony whose demographic pressure crossed an interior border. The colonial map drew, but the genome did not respect. The Haitian Revolution is in the Cuban 72%, a 19th century immigrant wave that arrived because the Caribbean's most profitable plantation system was destroyed and Cuba rebuilt it. The Culies from Guangdong are in the Cuban signal. The Guanche ancestors of Canarian settlers are in all 3 European percentages, and the Taino maternal haplogroups that the 2020 David Reich study found on every island simultaneously are in every result, running beneath 4 centuries of colonial demographic layering that changed the proportions but never fully displaced the foundation. Somewhere right now, a Puerto Rican family is sitting around a table looking at an ancestry DNA result that shows 14% indigenous ancestry and asking each other where it came from. A Dominican family is looking at 39% African and wondering why that number is so much higher than their cousins in Cuba. A Cuban American is looking at 72% European and not understanding why that number belongs to an island that was supposed to look like everywhere else in the Caribbean. The numbers are not a mystery. They are a record. The Jíbaro Mountains held some things that the plantation economy could not reach. The French colony across the island's interior border moved some things that the Spanish census never counted. The Haitian Revolution sent some people to Cuba who built a sugar economy that wrote itself into the genome before anyone was measuring it. The genome recorded all of it without judgment, without explanation, without the family story that would have made it legible. If your result is one of those, if you have carried a number that your grandmother could not account for and your grandfather never mentioned, this is part of what it is recording, not all of it. The record goes deeper than any single video can follow, but this is where the reading starts. Subscribe. And if you want, send this to someone who opened a Caribbean ancestry result and couldn't read it. The layers in those numbers go further than any single video can follow. Thanks for watching.